Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to this segment of Code Gurbani's a-sabad-a-day. Our recitation continues with the 11th pauri of War Rag Maj Mahalla Pehla. Slok Mahalla Pehla, ਜਾਂ ਪੱਕਾ ਤਾਂ ਕੱਟਿਆ ਰਹੀ ਸੋ ਪੱਲਰ ਵਾੜ ਸਣਕ ਸਾਰਾ ਚਿੱਥਿਆ ਕਣ ਲਿਆ ਤਨ ਝਾੜ ਦੋਏ ਪੁੜ ਚੱਕੀ ਜੋੜ ਕੇ ਪੀਸਣ ਆਏ ਬੈਠ ਜੋ ਦਰ ਰਹੇ ਸੋ ਉਬਰੇ ਨਾਨਕ ਅਜਬ ਡਿੱਠ ਮਹੱਲਾ ਪਹਿਲਾ ਵੇਖ ਜੇ ਮਿੱਠਾ ਕੱਟਿਆ ਕਟ ਗੁੱਟ ਬੱਦਾ ਪਾਏ ਖੁੰਡਾ ਅੰਦਰ ਰੱਖ ਕੇ ਦੇਨ ਸੋ ਮਲ ਸਜਾਏ ਰਸ ਕਸ ਟੱਟਰ ਪਾਈਐ ਤੱਪੇ ਤੈ ਵਿਲ ਲਾਏ ਬੀਸੋ ਫੋਕ ਸੰਭਾਲੀਐ ਦੀਜੇ ਅੱਗ ਜਲਾਏ ਨਾਨਕ ਮਿੱਠੇ ਪਤਰੀਐ ਵੇਖੋ ਲੋਕਾ ਆਏ ਪੌੜੀ ਇਕ ਨਾ ਮਰਨ ਨਾ ਚਿੱਤ ਆਸ ਘਣੇਰੀਆਂ ਮਰ ਮਰ ਜੰਮੇ ਨਿਤ ਕਿਸੇ ਨਾ ਕੇਰੀਆਂ ਆਪਨੜੇ ਮਨ ਚਿੱਤ ਕਹਿਣ ਚੰਗੇਰੀਆਂ ਜਮਰਾਜੇ ਨਿਤ ਨਿਤ ਮਨਮੁਖ ਹੇਰੀਆਂ ਮਨਮੁਖ ਲੂਣ ਹਰਾਮ ਕਿਆ ਨਾ ਜਾਣਿਆ ਬੱਧੇ ਕਰਨ ਸਲਾਮ ਖਸਮ ਨਾ ਭਾਣਿਆ ਸੱਚ ਮਿਲੇ ਮੁਖ ਨਾਮ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਭਾਵਸੀ ਕਰਸਨ ਤਖਤ ਸਲਾਮ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਪਾਵਸੀ. So in this passage, some interesting illustrations of evolution, of time, of death, and our mindfulness of death. So in the first slok, the example of wheat cropping is given to make a point, which we will see presently. It begins by saying, Ja Paka ta Katiya. When the crop is ripe, it is cut. Rahi so pallarwar, what remains is left in the field, and what remains is pallarwar, stubble and hedge. And then the process is sana kisara chithya. The crop is threshed with bristled ears, san kisara, the implement that is used to brush off the silks. And the grain is separated by winnowing. Kanalaya tan chad, you winnow off the grain. Doe pud chakki jod ke pisen aaye behet. And now the process of grinding begins. The kernel is placed between two millstones of the grinding machine, doe pud chakki jod, and the grinder sits by the machine, by the implement. Pisen aaye behet. In those days, of course, the machines were not automated, most likely, and we know that the millstones, the upper one had a handle that was then rotated. But the point being, this is the grinding process between two millstones. And then Guru Nanak concludes with something very interesting. Says Nanak, Jo dar rahe se ubre Nanak ajab dit. Something really wondrous, unusual he's observed, and that is that the kernel that stays close to the axle remains untouched. To Guru Nanak, that is indeed wondrous, and there is a lesson for us. And the lesson is that by staying close to the center, that is to the source, we can overcome the ups and downs of life by remaining there. In other words, we won't be ground or we won't be pulverized by the circumstances of daily existence. And then another example of the sugar cane being crushed and juiced out in order to produce something better, So therefore, any evolution requires a process of sacrifice. Vekh che mitha katiya, kat kut badda paye. He says, Vekh, look, what happens to the sugar cane when it is cut? Kat kut badda paye. First it is pruned and bundled. Badda paye, it's sort of collected in a bundle. And then what happens? Khunda andar rakhke. Then it is placed between the rollers. Deen so mal sajaye. And then it is crushed as if being punished by an enemy. Deen so mal sajaye. It's like punishment. That is the imagery. The juice is then placed in a vessel. Ras, the juice. Tattar paya, a vessel, a cauldron. And then it is heated. And when it boils, it appears to wail in pain. Tape ta villalai. Again, imagery. And even the residue is saved and burnt in the fire, is not let go, is not wasted. Biso fog samaliye. Nanak mithe patriye vekho loka aaye. So the message that Guruji wishes to give to us is, see what the process is to produce sweet jaggery out of the sugar cane. It has to sacrifice itself. A hint to us that to evolve, sacrifice is involved. And then he comes down to the real message here that he wants to also deliver along with this is in the pauri. And he says, Ikna marana chit. We are unmindful of the imminence of death. Ikna marana chit. We don't recall or remember death. We're unmindful. And yet aas ganeriyan. So we entertain endless hopes and expectations. Unmindful of the imminence of death, we entertain endless hopes and expectations. Mar jamme nit kise na keriyan. And what do we do by that? We perpetuate the cycle, but to no avail. The cycle of self-perpetuation. And we really are of no use to anyone. Mar jamme nit kise na keriya, of no use to anyone. And yet in our own minds, we consider ourselves very worthy and virtuous. Apanade man chit kahn changeriyan. We are very good. But here's the fate of people like that. Jambarajye nit manmukh heriyan. We are constantly subjected then to the trammels of time. We'll see what that means in a moment. And the next verse, Manmukh loon haram kya na jane, badde karan salam khasam na paniya. So the self-conceited, the manmukhs, within Gurmat, as they're explained, he says, Manmukh loon haram, they are not worthy, they are unworthy of their salt. They're undeserving, is what he is saying. Badde karan salam khasam na paniya. They're ungrateful. Kiya na janiya. And they acknowledge the Creator only when in trouble. Badde karam salam. And that is not pleasing. Na paniya. That is not pleasing. And that is not agreeable. The Master is pleased. In other words, anything that is successful happens only in the light of self-knowledge. Satya mile mukh naam sahib pavasi. So that's Guru Nanak's poetic way of saying that the Master is pleased only when self-knowledge is reflected. Mukh on our faces. In other words, when we are illumined by self-knowledge. In the world, we will bow to any authority, karsan takht salam, but in the end, what we end up being is really up to us according to our deeds. So that's the significance here, is that ikna maran na chit aas kaneriya. Why is Guru Nanak asking us to be mindful of death? Well, for one thing, death lies at the root of our existential fear. We are scared of physical extinction, and that fear fuels our lives, whether consciously or otherwise. That's what gets us into this free-floating anxiety. You know, in another place in Gurbani, he reminds us similarly of the imminence of death. How admi ha ikdami, he says. Death is imminent, forever around us, but we go about our lives as if we were personally immune from it. Ikana marana chitta. And death, as we know, is also called kal or jam, and it is linked to time. So when Guruji says that time will punish us, it means that the limitation of time should compel us to make the right choices, or else we'll remain in a rut, accomplishing nothing worthwhile. That's really the point. Imagine making choices if you are actually aware that your time is limited. You're likely to make more significant and authentic choices with that backdrop in your mind. You're less likely to waste your time. You're less likely to do things that do not have much value. So in other words, you will make authentic, meaningful choices, and then, given the lack of time, you will pursue them with a sense of urgency. That's the significance of this message. Choose carefully, pursue with urgency, and be prepared to sacrifice your current nature for something higher if you wish to evolve. Think of the sugar cane and think of the wheat. On that note, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.